Well, we're here. It's always good to get through those first couple of panels and bits and pieces, and it's always good to get not too far off track with Christopher Brown starting things off. So here we are, first panel. We're going to get straight into it. We're here to really talk about on the road to recovery, and in particular part Western Sydney is going to play in driving Sydney and New South Wales' recovery and moving forward. So, Elizabeth, one of the things that I'm really quite interested in is how COVID has changed our perspective and what lessons we've learnt, what that means for the projects that we might take forward, what we might change, and what do you think is a temporary change, and what do you think of the permanent changes we want to really reinforce with the investment decisions we take forward?
Thanks for that easy question, Theo.
Start off with the best.
To start off with, I think this is probably the question everyone's wrestling with in terms of what's permanent, what's temporary. To put it in the context, I guess, pre-COVID, at Transport in Greater Sydney in particular, we'd identified our number one goal in life was mode shift. So to get people out of cars, particularly individual cars, back onto their feet, walking, cycling, onto public transport. So COVID, I think, has provided some real lessons in that. I mean, we saw, first of all, about 80% of people stop travelling in March and start working from home. And so we learnt that lots of people can work from home, and there's still lessons about how many want to continue. For Western Sydney, I think one of the lessons we really learned, and I know Chris talks about this, is there's a lot of people who can't work from home. And then the other thing that we learn in sort of analysing what we've seen along the way is the importance of data. And that might sound a bit trite, but I guess we're just learning new sources of data every day, every week, and analysing that, because I don't think without really getting underneath the skin of what's happening in all different parts of Sydney, you can actually answer that last question about is this permanent and would you bank on it? In particular, are you going to bank projects on it? So the short answer for the short term is, we're committed to a ton of projects. As you heard from John, it's been all about actually acceleration rather than anything else, and that's all got to continue, both to create jobs, but also we were playing catch-up in some ways. In terms of whether after, the sort of next 5 years or whatever you might change some decisions about projects, I still think it's too early. Some of the more recent data, for instance, is telling us, clearly people are wanting to get back and travelling, and we're seeing mobility data increase. We look at Google mobility data, DSpark, the Opal travel, that sort of thing, but it's really interesting. So in the Sydney CBD, I think we've got sort of one type of, one level of demand coming back, and I think you can still see there's probably about 60% of workers not coming into the CBD, but we're really seeing different stuff out west. So in Parramatta, I think it's sitting at about 50%. But if you go out to places like Liverpool and Campbelltown, we're seeing really interesting stuff start to develop. In fact, there's increased travel into and out of each of Liverpool and Campbelltown at the moment above pre-COVID levels. So I don't know what that's telling us, but I think it's actually telling us that maybe some of the project work that's kicked off, not just us, but everyone, is actually getting people back to work. I guess what I'm saying is it's just really nuanced. It changes week to week at the moment. It was a long answer to say I don't really know, maybe, but that we're watching it really closely, and we'll obviously make decisions over the course of the next year or so. Both Futures Transport and the Greater Sydney Commission are revising their plans sort of early 2022 or in 2022. So we'll look at population and movement data to do that. Excellent.
So, Mark, apparently the best export out of Yorkshire since Jeff Boycott, I've been told.
Yeah, thank you.
We've lost a bit of time this year, albeit that many projects have been able to continue their momentum. But with your lessons from overseas, your observations in Australia, and you look at the pipeline that we've got in place, how do we fast track? How do we make up for some of the lost time? And what are the sort of innovation and design aspects you feel that we could bring forward to not just deliver stuff, but to deliver stuff that's going to take us into the 22nd century?
Thank you, Theo, for that. I suppose from my perspective, have we actually lost any time? Today we just have the sort of future in front of us. We have those opportunities that have all been sort of presented earlier. So I think we should reset the expectation. We haven't lost any time. And I think, as Elizabeth said about sort of COVID, I think COVID has actually shown that from a sort of construction and delivery perspective, the agility and the adaptable nature that we have in front of us and within the industry, obviously supported by state and the unions, we've been able to work through the sort of pandemic, keep sort of delivery focused. So I think the lost time question is probably not it. It's about looking at sort of the opportunities. I think we also need to harness the sort of the positivity we've had through COVID from a collaboration perspective, working with the broader sort of stakeholders. I think we have to build going forward from a sort of trusted perspective. We have to build on that trust, the working together. We need to embrace the sort of broader supply chain to create the solutions. I think far often from if you look at a pure contractor perspective, from a tier 1 contractor, we've loved our relationship with our sort of customers, but I think we have to embrace further into sort of the broader supply chain, our design partners, our design sort of consultants, to actually draw out the smarts to enable us to sort of build more efficiently and effectively going forward. I think when we look at how we are going to be more efficient, I think John mentioned earlier regarding the use of technology from a system-wide perspective. I think basic technology from a pure construction and a delivery focus needs to be embraced even more. I think there's a lot. We go out to the airport now and look at the amazing amount of earthworks that are being carried out. I was there on Friday at the visitor centre, and you just look at the works that are being carried out and you think, well, everything there should be automated. We should just be sitting in the control room and playing with the trucks. This isn't about losing jobs and investment. This is about getting more with the resource that we already have within our gift. So I think lots we can do. I think we do have to embrace sort of digital designs. We have to create, I think it's the old word, digital twins for everything we do. I don't think we should ever go out there and build anything that we haven't done in a virtual world before. That makes us safer. We should do more off-site manufacture. So I think there's a lot in our gift today that if industry does actually come together, does actually use that word collaborate, let's create that safe space that we can share, that we can work together. And don't be afraid of some failure. I think clearly to innovate, that does bring sort of failure, but we fail quick. Let's get out there and embrace change.
So Kerryn, a key part of what I heard just talked about then requires skills. It requires people, and going into the pandemic, we were already worrying about capacity constraints and skill gaps and how are we going to be able to deal with that, and cannibalising it across projects and blowing out costs as a result, or blowing out timelines. How serious a problem is the skills issue for delivering this infrastructure for you?
Look, it is very much front of mind. When we look at the huge pipeline of infrastructure that has been planned and proposed across governments, and I think, we've been very courageous in this, but I do think that where we have taken the time, or we always take the time to look at the interface risks of projects coming together physically, we now need to start to think about how we roll workforces on and off projects in a more planned way. We also really, and we heard some of this morning, we also really need to focus on how we bring through the new talent, bring through the young people, bring them onto projects, help them see that there's a plan in this, there's a life plan in this, and I do think that that's something that we need to make front and centre as we start to develop these projects, and as we take them forward for funding decisions and that type of thing from a government perspective. Because I do think that this is something that has been front of mind now for quite a few years, particularly in the project management space. And you've only got to look at the example at the moment around fruit pickers in Australia and what this means with closed borders and how we actually can get people in to be able to do this work. And we're not the only country that's hoping to build back better. So, there will be a huge opportunities for people to work in the infrastructure space. So we have to present ourselves as being the employer and the place that we can keep people in, and we can also attract people too.
So one of the challenges we have from an education perspective is that there's responsibility split between the federal and the state government, and there's private operators in that mix. Are we coordinated enough to be able to cut through some of the historical barriers that have held back being able to provide the pipeline of talent coming through? And does Western Sydney, through the City deal, for example, present a unique opportunity for us to transform the way that we deliver education?
Yeah, look, I think so traditionally in projects we've set sort of KPIs around workforces, whether they be learning workers and that type of thing. I think we actually need to bring that conversation much more into the room rather than just marking it down as sort of a tick the box as part of a requirement of a project going forward. We actually need to have a plan around that, and we need to be talking across government levels around, okay, so how are we going to achieve that? And I think that will help to break down some of those issues, but also draw out where there might be gaps that we actually need to invest more in. And I think that will be the key point going forward.
So to the panel, on education, often industry have talked about their concerns about the lack of talent coming through. Is industry playing a big enough role themselves in developing talent? I'm interested in your respective organisations and how you see yourselves playing a greater role to be able to get not just an acceleration in that, but a scaling up of the volume of workers we need. And what do you think the industry collaboration needs to be there to be able to truly make a meaningful inroads into that gap deficiency?
I think from a general sort of contractors and a construction perspective, I think it is that embracement with our sort of supply chain and actually working together to unlock the skills shortage that we clearly face. But I also think that when we look at other industries that have been impacted by the sort of the pandemic and COVID, is how we can reskill and actually sort of be broader than sort of the traditional skill set that we would look from a sort of construction and a contractor's perspective and an industry, is actually going broader, be more accepted, be more inclusive, because I think there's a lot of untapped skill. I think the Minister mentioned earlier regarding our success at Bateman's Bay, reaching to the broader community. So I think it's in our gift to do that, to be more inclusive, to actually attract a wider interest into what we actually do within such an exciting industry.
Malcolm?
I work in some of the large privately funded infrastructure projects, and what we see often is the contract we get from government imposes certain requirements about skills training. In recent years there's been gender targets as well, to Mark's point about broadening the resource pool. And as we've seen projects just get significantly larger and more complex, there's clearly been a reaching out to international markets to bring that resource here, and Mark's probably the perfect example of that happening recently. So the market is stretched, there's an awful lot on, but Australia is probably one of the hottest markets in the world at the moment for delivery of infrastructure projects. And with the COVID outcome here, I'm sure it's representing a very interesting destination for people to move to. So I think it's actually positive in the medium term.
So, Malcolm, we know that so much of the recovery is going to have rail and road infrastructure going to it, and much of that's been committed to for many years, and the government stayed the course on that. But a city is more than roads and rail. Where do you see, being from an investor and a leading investor in infrastructure in this country, the real investment opportunities that can stimulate jobs on the ground and ultimately start to give us a more rounded city?
Well, it's obviously, we're seeing a three cities plan. We're seeing Sydney move from, a very radial, initial master plan to something where we've now, the orbital rail link, the Western, Greater West Metro, and the way that's going to change, and those stations are going to become not just stations. I think John made the point, they're placemaking opportunities, they're community, there'll be significant intermodal connections, and I think around those stations, whether it's value capture or the station is the catalyst for very significant development, I think there's broad opportunity for not just putting a commercial tower on top of the station, but what are the opportunities, affordable housing, social housing. I know Chris mentioned that prior to John getting up, but I do see great opportunity for that in the region. A lot of the there's the word local seems to emerge for me. We've got this changing dynamic in Sydney. It's happened in COVID. I think the impact of technology and what does that mean as to where people move and how they move and where they move for work in particular. I think there's we're really on the cusp of a very exciting phase in how Western Sydney develops in that regard as these transport plans are delivered.
And with a lot of that, we know that with something like the rail line, demand will be built up over time, and so the government is very much a leading in and a risk taker on helping set that all up and subsidising it in the short term for ultimately the long-term gain. In other parts of that infrastructure supply chain, whether it be housing or social amenity, do we also need to, is government or private going to play a bigger role in a longer-term, more patient return on investment for those projects if we're going to deliver shorter-term amenity and opportunity?
I mean, I think if you look at the rail projects that are being delivered, it's government's not necessarily seeking private sector participation. From a financial perspective, it's really about risk transfer and getting, the right whole of life approach to, to operating these assets for the longer term. So the government taking the risk on the fare box is an underlying principle in that. But what that infrastructure is doing, and the phrase value capture is often thrown around in this, is it is the catalyst for that development to occur. And whether it's significant further private development occurring around these stations or in areas that present significantly greater accessibility for workforce and living, I think whether it's the private sector will come, and it'll come for commercial development, private development, and there'll be certain further schools, hospitals, for example, or other areas where there's potential partnership opportunities with the private sector. So I think it's all on the table, really. It's not a case of, managing the demand risk. I think the infrastructure unlocks it, and then it's really, how the market responds to that. Yeah.
So, Elizabeth, often what we find is location has a conflict of uses, and there's many things you could put on there. And we've heard the Minister talk about how, particularly around this metro stations, that there's an opportunity to recover some of the cost of the project, not all the cost. But equally, those same locations where you could get some great highest and best commercial use might also be great locations for education or broader community facilities. Are we ready for the conflict of that, the conversation to make choices there? Because that's a tough one. Pay it or invest into the long term into community.
Yeah, and it's not only around the metro stations. They're obviously where the prime discussion is these days, because it's in Metro's purpose to do property development and precinct development around the stations. But we're looking at Circular Quay, Central Station, Redfern, the same thing, and trying to get that balance right between what's the burden on the taxpayer purse to actually pay for the work compared to what we give back to the community and what we make as a place. I guess the metro stations are a balance because they are a catalyst for development mostly in the areas they're going into, whereas the big stations in the city, Central, Redfern, Circular Quay, they have the potential to be the icons of the city, and so that puts a different lens on it. I guess what we try to do is get as broad a number of stakeholders involved, as many views as we can, to try and make sure we get that balance right. But I wouldn't say it's one of the easier things to do in the world, and that's why sometimes these things don't move quickly either. I mean, Metro has a clear delivery time frame and it will meet that, whereas where we're trying to retrofit something on a station or a place that's already built, that's much more difficult because you have all the competing needs. But we're really aware of it. We're probably a different place to what we were 5 years ago in transport, in that if you could hear the varying views that we take into account to try and balance those outcomes, it's very different. We're not just focused on either the transport outcome or the property returns. We're trying to balance the social outcomes and the long-term community contribution as well.
So one of the things that I'm bullish on and believe that Western Sydney can lead on in particular is around Industry 4.0, the transformation of the energy sector and renewables, which the government's made significant strides in its policies around, and how we can create that new generation of manufacturing and advanced industry that feeds these new technology sets. How much do you see the investment into smart technology and sustainable technology being the new infrastructure investment of Western Sydney, as opposed to the traditional bricks and mortar or road and pavements?
Would you like me to go?
Over to you.
Look, very much so, I guess, and we've already touched on, the Minister sort of touched on a piece of it this morning, but I think we can be a bit more explicit in terms of the ambition we put out there for zero-emission buses. That is a bit of a no-brainer for me in terms of Australian manufacturing, and the industry is already responding. Even before we put out that huge ambition last week, we had already signalled pretty strongly that that's where we were going, and the the joy is that the industry has already responded. So we can see a couple of existing manufacturers retooling, reskilling to produce zero-emission buses, and a new manufacturer come in who's setting up in Western Sydney now, sort of with a temporary facility in Glendinning and then setting up more permanently in Moss Vale. And that, for me, is exactly what we want to see happen. It's a bit of a leapfrog opportunity because, you know, traditional diesel buses, you know, have been, although they've been assembled here a bit, they rely on sort of old-fashioned manufacturing a bit, and so overseas advantage. But with the change in technology, it gives the opportunity for us to leapfrog. And the other reason the Western Parkland City is a great place for us to really focus on that sort of stuff is because it needs new depots, it needs new land to do stuff. Refitting depots that are already in the city, we can do some of it, but it's tricky. Again, you're retrofitting. Out west, you've got much more scope to start from scratch, and so the opportunity is there to put the whole ecosystem together. And we've also heard about hydrogen, you know, the opportunity for people to manufacture hydrogen out there, and then we can leverage off that and use that. I think it's enormous. But what we need to do is signal to business that we're serious and give them enough scale so they can tool up and match that, and I think that's what we're trying to do.
Kerryn, do you think that the policy footing differences or misalignment that exists between the federal and the state government on certain aspects of energy and net zero type policy, do you see that disrupting the city deal, or do you feel that the governance and the participants have the right outcome and aspirations that they can just work through those nuances?
Yeah, look, I think that the City Deal provides a fantastic opportunity for us to work together on that. And I'm obviously not going to get into too much of a political conversation because I'd like to still have a job. But it is something, it is that opportunity to actually sort of lay all the cards on the table. And then also, it's not just with the three levels of government, it's also working with industry. And I think through the last 12 months, I've seen a huge lift in how we actually engage with industry and ask questions and take that advice and bring that back into some of the decision making. So I do think that the City Deal provides a fantastic platform for that, but I also think that the world has changed, and hopefully we will be courageous enough to continue to really try and get the best ideas from industry into government policy.
So Malcolm, in the vein of alternate investments and ideas, we're seeing a lot of ideas coming forward from the government around a multi-utility corridor for the Western Parkland City and how it may seem to integrate many utilities into a single service or piece of infrastructure, smart infrastructure in the way that that could be rolled out. Are these the sort of new investment horizon projects that traditional infrastructure funders are looking for, or is the risk still open there as to their capacity to really get involved?
I think one of the new areas has certainly been technology. Data storage, for example, has been a very growing area of infrastructure investment. Whenever we talk about utilities, I find that a very complex area to engage in. But what is clear is that infrastructure investors have moved from sort of core to adjacencies. So essential services, community assets that deliver benefits to the broader community. It's really if you can take a view on what a long-term cash flow is, I think there are infrastructure investors who will run the ruler over it. It's about a long-term cash flow that can be based around population growth, which for Western Sydney is obviously a fantastic story at the moment.
So Mark, to close out, you're the most recent arrival to Sydney. You somehow snuck through the COVID web and made your way into our beautiful shores, and we're welcome to have you here.
2 weeks in the Meriton.
Thank you, Meriton, for looking after him. You haven't been indoctrinated like many of us for many years about why Western Sydney is so magnificent and why it will offer so much to the world. In the minute that we've got left, what are the three things that come to mind for you why it represents such a tremendous opportunity?
I think, well, today says it all. I suppose the enthusiasm from a broader sort of New South Wales perspective to Western Sydney to embrace the three-city strategy is infectious. Spent some time, as I said earlier, on Friday, actually going to see the area, to sort of boots on the ground, as you would say, and to get a feel for the communities. I think when John put the sort of picture of St Mary's and how that's going to sort of generate that area, it just brings that sort of passion. and what you see with sort of the Western Sydney leadership is something that you didn't see back in London with this whole development around just the physical infrastructure of Crossrail. Is a whole sort of team and the community pulling together for that success, and you certainly sort of feel that and get that here.
Excellent. So everyone, from our incoming CEO of the GSC, one of the best decisions that's been made in Sydney for a long time, to Mark, Malcolm and Kerryn, can I please give them a round of applause?